Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. Other Minds, founded in 1993 in San Francisco by Charles Amirkhanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 3 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from our 28th Other Minds Festival, which will take place September 25th to 28th, 2024 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. You're listening to I Am the Spring, You Are the Earth by today's guest, Dr. Soosan Lolavar. Lolavar is a British-Iranian composer, researcher, and lecturer living in London. Having studied Iranian classical music, her music draws on ideas from both Western and Iranian traditions with a focus on the diaspora experience. Her album Girl with the London Chamber Orchestra Ruthless Jabiru was released in March 2024, and her book Embodied Research Through Music Composition and Evocative Life Writing, Disrupting Diaspora was published just last month. Lolavar's book examines how attending to the lived experience of diaspora can impact our understanding of the term through the lens of her practice as a composer, and I'm very pleased to be talking with her about it today. So welcome to the podcast, Soosan.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So to start off, what are embodied research and evocative life writing, and why did you choose those as a focus to write about your music?
Yeah, so for me, embodied research methods are methods that bring to light kind of all of the things that we have somehow decided are kind of irrelevant to and stand outside of academic research. So academic research, I think, in the social sciences and the humanities and the arts is still kind of playing by the rules that were established by the natural sciences. So we still feel like we have to tend towards empiricism or positivism and talking about the social or human world in this sort of detached way through methods that we can probably generally define as this kind of detached observation, this idea that we stand back from the world as a researcher, we observe this kind of delineated and enclosed world from afar, and by doing so we can make pronouncements about it that are kind of relevant. And what we do by doing this is we bracket out from what for me is some of the most important parts of human life. So we decide that emotion is irrelevant from academic work, that pain is irrelevant, that experience, that loss, all of these, joy, all of these things that make us uniquely human are the things that we don't tend to talk about in academic writing. And strong emotions, experiences like diaspora, experiences of otherness are kind of things that are palpably experienced through the body. It's very difficult to talk about those aspects of life without talking about the body. So for me, what I call embodied research methods are methods which both speak to these aspects of human life that we've decided to stop speaking about, but they also kind of actively attend to bodily experience. So they recognize that there actually is no way of standing back from the world and observing it from afar, because by our very nature of being in the world, we are always physically interacting with it. And actually, kind of the fundamental basis we have for all knowledge producing practices is physical engagement with materials. There's no way of standing back from the world and not being part of it. And for me, the way that I can see that really clearly, for example, is when you look at a child, like my nephew, for example, is 2 years old at the moment. And if you look at a little child interacting with the world, they do not do detached observation. That's kind of why they're such a nightmare to sort of keep safe, because a 2-year-old doesn't look at a box and sort of sit and quietly ponder the details of a box. A 2-year-old is getting involved. They are grabbing it, they're sticking it in their mouth, they're throwing it, they're picking it up, they're completely physically exploring it. And that's kind of what we all do all the time. And when we're thinking about the world, we're remembering that fundamental experience of physically engaging with it. But for some reason, we've decided to bracket that out from academic work and sort of talk about the world as if it's not as if we're not constantly physically engaging with it. So embodied research methods are about bringing us back to that fundamental way of understanding the world.
Yeah, and that seems like something that would be especially important in the arts, which have much to do with emotion and, people's reactions to music.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you also explain what double consciousness is and how that affected your work and your sense of belonging?
Yeah, so double consciousness is a theory that comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, a theorist writing kind of in the early 20th century. And he uses it to describe his experience as a Black American. So double consciousness explains this sense of psychic splitting, of the splitting of the self between two kind of opposing ideals. And they're two sort of ideas that are built in direct opposition to each other, and where, because of that direct opposition, one aspect of the self kind of dominates and undermines the humanity of the other side. So in Du Bois's experience, that is being a Black man and being American. And he uses this evocative way of writing about his life to explain that kind of split. So I think that the language he uses to talk about it is, he says, I look upon the Negro as a kind of, in a fundamentally negative way, but then I also recognize that I am the Negro. And this is a theory that has been kind of taken on by other theorists and expanded in various different ways. And I use it as a theory for understanding my own relationship with my Iranianness. So growing up as Iranian British, growing up in the UK, and having what I can now see was from the very beginning, a fundamentally, kind of only a negative representation of Iranianness with which to understand my own identity. So growing up in the shadow of the Iranian Revolution, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, and then subsequently things like 9/11 and all of these global dynamics, which gave representations of Iranianness particularly, but the broader Middle East in general, as fundamentally kind of negative, barbaric, dangerous, something to be extremely suspicious of if you are kind of based in the West. And I was unable to conceive of myself outside of that logic and outside of that dynamic. So I kind of saw Iranianness as fundamentally kind of negative and dangerous, at the same time as understanding that I was part of that. And that's a kind of very disruptive way of experiencing your own identity. And it kind of, for me, it resulted in this psychic splitting where I wasn't really able to perceive of myself as a sort of kind of united individual. I was always, these two sides of me kind of felt like they were at war all the time.
Speaking of your diaspora experience, you describe yourself in the book as feeling, quote, too Iranian for my British life, too British within my Iranian community when you were young. So did you find that bringing that tension into your music in any way ameliorated that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to start exploring that. As I talk about in the book as well, I think when I first started to explore that, the kind of splitting between those two things, I actually found that I was reproducing the splitting initially. So I found that I was creating music, which I mean, like any artistic endeavor, when you start, like there has to be room for failure. Like you have to do it kind of badly to start, to enable yourself to keep doing it and get better. But I can see that when I started to, because my sort of initial training in music was in Western classical music, and it was about sort of 10, 15 years ago that I started to explore Iranian classical music as well. And I can see that in the beginning, it was a kind of very well-meaning music, but there was a kind of inherent idea of this fusion, which to me was really problematic, because for me, the idea of fusion relies on this idea of a sense of anterior purities. These two things have to be pure and separate and sometimes built in opposition to each other in order to then be fused. So I could see that I was just recreating double consciousness. I didn't really know how to do it outside of that logic. That had been my logic for my whole life. But eventually, over time, working with these different musics in different ways, really kind of bringing it into a bodily process over and over again, I started to, and this is an ongoing, lifelong endeavor. I don't think I've finished. I don't think I've got there. I think it's always changing and moving. The target is always moving a little bit away from where you are. But I think I started to move towards creating work which speaks for itself and is complexly tied to ideas of Iranian music, Western music, and all of the things that relate to those things, but isn't defined by them, and hopefully moves away from this sense of identities as kind of semantically closed units that can either work in harmony or not. More towards this sense of a kind of dynamic becoming that is completely unique to me and my experiences, and speaks, I don't speak for any other kind of experience of these things, but hopefully in the doing of it, it kind of creates an idea of dynamics that can go beyond this like binary opposition between senses of self, basically.
Do you find that your music that combines these different influences received differently in the UK versus in Iran versus somewhere else? Because you've spent a lot of time in Iran.
Yeah, it's received differently in all different contexts and over different periods of time. I think there was a period in the UK, for example, especially as in this kind of early nascent period of me exploring this, where in a way, and I talk about this in the book, in a way that made me slightly uncomfortable, I started to, my funding applications became very successful very quickly because, I think, the system of funding in the UK is very complicated, but I think there was a very well-meaning, which I was grateful for, sense in funding circles of like, this is good music to fund. This is multiculturalism. This is showing, the different kind of cultures that exist in the contemporary UK, and then let's promote this, which is obviously great. As a musician, you want to get funding, but then I also felt like I was part of this weird, like, hybridity sale. And I was also aware that, like, I speak with a British accent, and because of my Britishness, I was a very safe example of hybridity. I wasn't actually really forcing British institutions to reckon with, their Islamophobia and the different kinds of dynamics that make it really difficult for certain people to do well and certain people's art to be kind of championed. There's a history of female Iranian artists. So, for example, there's in the post 9/11 era in the US, there was like a massive uptick in memoirs by Iranian women. And they suddenly did really, really well, in terms of publishing. And part of that is because of, an interest in a culture that's very different. But there are some writers who write about it as in the kind of post 9/11 era, there was a real fashion for memoirs by women who had, quote unquote, survived the Middle East. And it's interesting that there was no interest in memoirs by Iranian men. Iranian men continued to be constructed as kind of dangerous and frightening, and they weren't given many opportunities for characterization outside of basically being kind of violent and frightening or terrorists. So I was also aware of, like, me as an Iranian woman and my work being kind of co-opted in these complex dynamics. And in Iran, those dynamics are very different. There is a kind of pretty established genre in Iran called musiqi talfighi, which means fusion music fundamentally. But one of the examples of that is music which blends Western classical music and Iranian classical music together. So there's a lot of Iranian artists in Iran working in this way. Obviously, their approach to it is very different. They're not necessarily dealing with the dynamics of diaspora in the way that I am. Their relationship to Western music and Iranian music is obviously very, very different. But Western music has a kind of 120-year history in Iran. It's been taught and played in Iran for a pretty concerted period of time. So it's a local kind of music, but it's a particularly Iranian form of Western classical music. So their relationships to it are very different. But yeah, like it's wonderful to have my music performed in Iran, and it's definitely, the dynamics are different. And yeah, it's really interesting to observe the ways in which I'm received in Iran and the ways in which I'm received in the UK and the kind of complexities between those two things.
So speaking of your approach, you write that music can be a way of knowing about diaspora rather than the output of diasporic encounters. And that, that seems to be pretty central to the message of your book. So what do you mean by this? And could you maybe also explain what you mean by ways of knowing?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in, as I say, the ways of knowing, the ways that the epistemologies that we have for understanding the world, basically. And as I say, academic writing has tended towards a pretty narrow range of epistemologies, which are kind of empirical, and they are defined by this idea that we step back and we observe dispassionately and we consider things, and then we analyze the world from a distance, and through doing that we get to some kind of deeper truth about what the world is. And I think that there are so many ways of knowing. Well, if we use a kind of narrow range of epistemologies to think about the world, we're going to have similar kinds of outputs about the ways we understand the world. But if we just think about what it is to be a human being, there are ways that you know things that can't really be defined as analytical or objective observed knowledge. And some of the best theorists, I think, for understanding this come from dance. So there's a theorist called Sheets Johnstone who talks about thinking in moving. And she talks about how dancers, after they, when they have developed this relationship to dance over many, many years, moving becomes itself a way of knowing something. And it's not that thinking occurs and then movement happens following thinking. It's that the moving itself is a way of thinking. Moving around a space, moving your body in a particular way is a way of thinking about the world. Another way of thinking about it is if we think about chefs, for example. Chefs have a physical understanding and way of knowing about food and flavor and science and all the complex magical things that happen when you're making food. And sometimes actually asking them to put it into language can be quite challenging, actually, because it's not necessarily language-based experience. It's a physical experience. You only know how to make a meringue when you physically feel what the egg whites feel like. If you explain something in a book, I mean, like any of us have seen when we try and fail to make recipes, explaining to someone how to do that in a book is one level of understanding, and you need to feel it with your body. And I think music is the same. So music is like any other form of art in that, I draw a lot on the theories of Tim Ingold, an anthropologist who talks about making, in that it's a physical relationship with a material. So just as like a sculptor, say they have a lump of marble, in creating a sculpture, what they're doing is they're physically interacting with that marble over and over and over again. And that marble is pushing back. That marble is not just an inert lump of nothing that doesn't have an existence until you as a human come and start kind of chiseling away at it. It has a vibrancy. It pushes you in certain directions. There are certain things that marble can do, and there are certain things that it can't do. And as a sculptor, you learn over time to really kind of listen to and follow that material. And Ingold talks about it as an ongoing correspondence between artisan and material. And for me, that's exactly what composing is. Composing is this embodied experience of working with sound, where you both push the sound in certain directions, but the sound pushes back on you and tells you, no, this is where I'm going now, actually. And it's a way of knowing that you feel it in your body over time. You know where things have to go, and you know when things are wrong. And that's why it's so difficult for composers, I think, sometimes to put their practice into language in an effective way, because it's a really deep way of knowing that transcends language, really. And I think because of this tendency of academic work to kind of ignore the embodied, move straight to the objective and think of ourselves as disembodied minds, we kind of miss all this way of knowing about stuff. So for me, bringing that embodied knowledge into Diaspora, it's really exciting. I think it has the potential to bring us to bring new insights that we wouldn't understand in any other way, basically.
That's quite an interesting way to think about it. Let's talk about some specific pieces of yours now. I'd like to start with Tradition Hybrid Survival, which is a concerto for cello and string orchestra, and is concerned with shifting notions of identity in diaspora influence between your travels between the UK and Iran. So tell us about that piece.
Yeah, so I wrote this piece in a period when I was, traveling. I think I went to Iran 3 times that year, which felt like a lot of backwards and forwards. And it was actually, I found that period very, very challenging, because being aware, now that I'm so aware of the kinds of code switching that I engage in, talking about 2 British for Iran, 2 Iranian for the UK, every time I would move between those places, I would have to engage in an entire process of self-reproduction and then back again. And doing that 3 times in a year, it really completely exhausted me. And I was just really aware of the feelings of, so in the piece, the string ensemble are divided into 3 groups, which are labeled local, diaspora, and outsiders. And those kind of labelings came from this experience of feeling constantly moved between those groups, feeling local somewhere one minute, then feeling like I'm from the diaspora, then a complete outsider, and sometimes feeling all of those things in, the same hour. And this kind of constant feeling of sort of swirling around and feeling quite kind of disconcerted by it. And yeah, this piece kind of came out of that process. And interestingly, the piece was initially commissioned by an Iranian ensemble, which would have been incredible. But unfortunately, as often happens in Iran, the kind of financial and situation in Iran became so difficult that the commission never happened, and it never got performed there, which was a huge shame. I'm still really, really keen for it to be performed in Iran. But I'd written the piece anyway, but it ended up being premiered in London. And yeah, the piece kind of explores, it sets up these groups, local, diaspora, outsiders. And then by having these kind of groups, I'm able to sort of explore what those things mean musically. And by exploring those things musically, it enables this like physical handling of these concepts that I can like literally pick them up, move them around, look at them from different angles, think about how they sound. And that kind of enabled me to sort of understand those very concepts in a new way. Because as I say, if I just objectively sat back and reflected on what it means, what those things mean, I would unveil a certain number of insights. But when I'm physically getting my hands in there, like the 2-year-old with the box, which I think is what music enables, I was able to sort of see them in new and different ways, which kind of enabled some insights into the idea of diaspora for me.
And so could you talk about how representing those different groups sonically is perceived by the listener, particularly maybe someone who hasn't, read your program notes necessarily?
Yeah, from the point of view of the listener, so just the local and diaspora groups are both on stage. They're separate from each other. The local group are in the middle. They're really kind of tightly, they're seated very close together. And the diaspora group are a little bit further away, and they're separated from each other by being kind of in a line, kind of a curved line. And then the outsider group is off stage, and they are unseen, unconducted. They just kind of suddenly appear a couple of times in the piece. So from the point of view of the listener who's not read anything, it's a kind of physical separation. From the point of view of the listener, the outsiders group is probably the most clearly defined in that we don't see them. The material they play is very, very simple and repeats over and over again, very, very slowly. So it's the outsiders group are this kind of disembodied, strange group from nowhere who come in and completely change the whole dynamic of the piece. The piece has many different moods, but the piece might be extremely kind of dynamic and have a great deal of movement, a great deal of kind of energy. And then suddenly the outsiders come in and everything completely is suspended in animation at that moment, which kind of helps to create this sense of just a total otherness that just comes in from nowhere, changes everything, and then is gone again, which kind of represented a lot of the feelings I had about myself in these places, myself as a kind of slightly free-floating, identityless entity, as I felt in certain times when I was moving between Iran and the UK. But what's interesting is in the end, the outsiders control everything. Like they come in at the very end. They shift the harmony from a center of G to a center of B. And everybody on stage at the very end of the piece is playing along with the outsiders, really straining to hear what they're doing because it's very quiet and they haven't got their part notated. So they're really having to try and work out what they're doing. And this sense of kind of the outsiderness sometimes being the thing that just kind of takes over and can kind of usurp everything else because of its weird strangeness and kind of being beyond everything else.
Is that saying something about your sense of your own diasporic identity?
Yeah, I wonder, because this is, the way that I wrote this piece. There were elements of this piece the elements of the kind of local diaspora outsider thing, which the decisions were made very actively, and then the music kind of took it from there. But then there are also elements of it that just kind of happened. And to call it intuition is to kind of simplify what's going on in that process, because what I think what's going on is a really, really deeply embodied way of knowing through your body, working with sound that you can't really put into words, because it's sort of something that you've built over, for me, 30 plus years of working very intensely with music. But yeah, I wonder if the way that piece ends there, that there's a bit of a kind of nihilism about it. I think this was a really challenging period in my life. I can look back on it and see that moving between the UK and Iran in this time, working very intensely on my PhD. PhDs are all very difficult, but also the fact that my PhD involved really, really emotional, deep work looking into my life and some of the most painful bits of my life and then putting them into language. I think it was a very difficult time. And I think there's a kind of nihilism of the ending that the outsiders just kind of take it and it ends up as this kind of strange suspended thing which doesn't really have any kind of anchoring. I think it speaks to like where I was at that time in my life, to be honest.
Well, let's listen to an excerpt of Tradition Hybrid Survival by Soosan Lolavar, performed by Ruthless Jabiru, with conductor Kelly Lovelady and cellist Roxana Albayati, from Lolavar's recently released album Girl on Non-Classical. Your piece, I Am the Spring, You Are the Earth, is for improvising ensemble. So how do you approach the concept of diaspora differently here? And perhaps you could talk about the concept of wayfaring as it relates to this piece.
Yeah, so this piece is very, very different from traditional hybrid survival. This piece uses a kind of somewhat text-based score. It's written on graph paper. The duration is kind of divided into sort of 10 seconds, and there are kind of text-based instructions for each of the players. It has a huge amount of openness. There are sections which just say solo, improvise, for example. And in doing that, leaves a lot of space for the musicians to kind of lay their own trail from one place to another. And in doing this was the piece that enabled me to start thinking about diaspora in a new way. And the theory I use to do this is Tim Ingold's theory, where he talks about the difference between transport-orientated ideas of travel and what he calls wayfaring-oriented ideas of travel and place. So transport is probably the most prevalent analogy for thinking about travel and place. And in transport, we tend to think of place as a kind of empty locus that exists in the world. A place is, somewhere that exists, and you can walk into the place and you can walk out of the place. But whether or not you are there, the place still exists in the world. And similarly, from that idea of place, we get an idea of travel, which is that you might be in a place at one moment, then you want to enter a new place. So you go through a period of travel, which is a kind of period where you exit the world, you become alienated from the world, and then you re-enter the world into a new place. So a kind of way of thinking about that is, so I live in London, we have an underground system. So you might enter the underground system in Oxford Circus, go underground, and in that period, you're sort of outside of the world. You don't really exist in the world. And then you pop up again at Marble Arch and you're back in the world. And those are the kind of prevalent analogies we have for thinking about place and travel. And his argument is that these are a kind of a fallacy. They don't exist. There is no way for us to exit the world for a period of time and re-enter. Like, we are always in the world. Human and non-human subjects never leave the world at any point. So he talks about travel and place as much more akin to wayfaring. So in the idea of wayfaring, you are always in the world at all points. And place is not this kind of delineated sort of locus that just exists. Place is brought into being by the dynamic travel of human and non-human subjects. And so the analogy for thinking about that is not place as like a sort of circle that you enter and leave. Place is a series of trails. We are always laying down trails. We are always kind of moving our way along the world, laying these trails as we go. And it's through that process of dynamically laying trails that the idea of place comes into being. And crucial to that is the idea that you are always somewhere, and that somewhere is always connected to somewhere else. So he talks about these dense networks, these webs that are built from the trails that we lay down as we move through life. The way this relates to I Am the Spring, You Are the Earth is that the way that the music operates, this very open score, lots of space for the performers, they are basically enabled to lay down their own trails. So the music might start in one place and it kind of moves to another, but the way they move between those two places is kind of open for them. And it creates this kind of flow, this sense of, like, one of the theorists whose work I used to talk about it, she talks about flow like water goes through an aqueduct. And it creates this sense of constant dynamic movement. And the ways in which that has kind of enabled me to think about diaspora in a different way is to move away from this idea of fixed, delineated, objective, binary places. The places labeled Iran and the place labeled the UK, which I always experienced in opposition to each other. And by experiencing that way, it reproduced this sense of myself as this psychic splitting, this double consciousness, which was incredibly painful. And if you move away from that and think about dynamic trails where everywhere you are on that trail is connected to everywhere else. So to put it simply, a place labeled Iran and a place labeled the UK for me are always continually co-present by my very existence along the trail that links those two things together. And this way of understanding this really came out because of writing this piece of music in this way. I don't believe I would have been able to conceive of or develop that theory without the music, because the music enabled a physical handling of those processes that I could then start to think through, in the context of my life.
So I guess they're an example of the music being a way of knowing about diaspora.
Absolutely. And yeah, the music, it's like kind of brought this understanding to me, and the process of making the music, listening to the music, analyzing the music, all of those things, it wouldn't have been possible without those processes.
The recording that we'll listen to in a moment by Ruthless Jabiru includes a santur. Could you talk about that instrument and your relationship with it as part of your exploration of diaspora and your connection to Iran?
Yeah, the santur is an Iranian instrument. There's also an Indian version. It's slightly different. I play the Iranian version, and it's a hammered dulcimer. So it's like a sort of trapezoid wooden box with strings running across it, which you hit with hammers. So it's basically the kind of pre-mechanized piano. If the piano is basically hammers being hit by strings, but operating it via a key, this is you doing the hammers yourself. And it's a really wonderful instrument. It's an instrument that when I really formalized my study in Iranian music was actually in the US. I got a Fulbright to go to Carnegie Mellon and study with Reza Vali, who's a brilliant composer and expert in both Western and Iranian classical music. And while I was there, it turned out there was a guy who lived locally he was actually a cardiologist, but he was from Iran, and he was a brilliant santur player. He studied with one of the great kind of masters of santur. And I had lessons with him in the period I was there. And it was very challenging. It was difficult to go from, having been a composer for so long to going back to being a total beginner at something musically. I think it's really good for your ego, but it's quite difficult. And I studied the radif, which is the kind of collected volume of melody types that you study as part of kind of an Iranian classical music training. And I studied the radif with him, and it quickly became clear that probably playing in a super traditional way wasn't going to be the way I was going to approach this. When I came back from the US, I continued my santur practice in a much more experimental way. And I've prepared my santur. I've, kind of broken it quite a lot by attaching wires to it and different things and miking it and doing all kind of slightly more experimental processes. But it's become more and more the instrument on which I write all my music, partly because you can tune it to anything. It has kind of infinite tuning capacity. So it's much more useful to me than, for example, the piano, which, forces you to use equal temperament. And yeah, it's become a really, really exciting part of my practice, actually. So I released an album June 23 called Every Strand of Thread and Rope, which is an album of music for solo detuned violin. So the violin is detuned by a minor sixth, so the whole sound of it changes. But the whole album was written on the santur. So it's an album for violin, but I think you can hear these kind of ghostly echoes of the santur within it because the techniques being used are very kind of from the santur. The way the sounds are produced kind of creates this sense of a kind of, as I say, a hidden ghostly santur in the background. And that, for me, again, brings back these interesting dynamics of diaspora, like using an instrument like violin, which has particular connotations in terms of its ethnic lineage. But then there's a ghostly sound of some other instrument underneath as well. So yeah, the santur's become a really, really interesting part of my practice.
Great. Well, let's listen to an excerpt of Soosan Lolavar's I Am the Spring, You Are the Earth, performed by Ruthless Jabiru, conductor Kelly Lovelady, and santur soloist Faraz Eshi Sahai. Soosan Lolavar's book, Embodied Research Through Music Composition and Evocative Life Writing, Disrupting Diaspora, is available now wherever you buy books. We'll be back in a few weeks for my interview with composer and guitarist Giacomo Fiore about his upcoming album on Other Minds Records, Lost Horse, Washed Drone. Thank you, Soosan, for talking with me today, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 28th festival is September 25th to 28th, 2024, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.